Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the darkest corners of World War II. And no, it's not the battlefields, or the bombs, or even the enemy trenches. It's worse. Because tonight, you're going to see how soldiers slowly unravelled piece by piece in ways nobody ever talks about. If you enjoy snoozing to the sound of historical suffering, I'd love it if you gave this a like or even subscribed. It really helps, unlike military rations, which helped mostly with diarrhea. And I'm always curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your city and the time it is there. I love seeing our sleepy little global community connect. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker nearby, and let's ease into tonight's journey, because you're about to discover why the real war wasn't always fought with bullets. You're sitting in a muddy foxhole somewhere in the French countryside, staring at a leaf that has, against all odds, managed to grow from the stump of a cratered tree. You notice the stillness first, the kind that feels too quiet, too staged, like nature itself is holding its breath. You feel the tight ache of tension buzzing in your neck, the kind that doesn't go away with rest, because there is no rest. Not here, not now. Something scuttles across your boot. It's either a beetle or the ghost of your last good decision. You're not sure anymore. You stopped keeping track around the time your toothbrush fell into a trench toilet and you just kept using it. And here's the thing. Everyone talks about the bullets, the battles, the bravery. But what they don't tell you is that most World War II soldiers lost their grip long before they saw the enemy. Because insanity didn't strike like lightning. It trickled in, drop by drop, through every sleepless night, every rotting sock, every weirdly aggressive potato ration. Statistically, over 500,000 US soldiers were diagnosed with what they called neuropsychiatric conditions during World War II. That's 500,000 minds fraying under the pressure of a war that never paused, not even when the guns did. What made it worse was how utterly unprepared the military was. Shell shock from World War I had already proven that the brain could break without warning. But instead of evolving their approach, the World War II solution was mostly just, don't talk about it and hope it goes away. The same logic they used for trench foot and unwashed mess kits. They had rest camps, sure, which were about as restful as camping on a tarmac during a thunderstorm. Soldiers were handed cigarettes and told to stop being weird. There were lectures, leaflets, sometimes a pep talk about how their anxiety was probably just homesickness. Meanwhile, the real causes of mental collapse were everywhere. You didn't need to be in a firefight to unravel. All it took was 6 weeks of canned meat, one latrine-related horror, and a bunkmate who snored like a freight train carrying regrets. And then there was the noise, the random, sudden, unfiltered noise. Bombs one day, silence the next. A door slam, a rat, a cough. Every sound was a maybe. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's death. Maybe it's just your brain learning how to twitch. Even boredom could push you over the edge. That long, gnawing stretch of time where nothing happened, and yet you still couldn't relax. You'd think boredom was safe. But in war, boredom was a bomb with no timer. The truth is, World War II didn't just leave physical scars. It shredded mental wiring. It wrapped trauma in barbed wire and told soldiers to walk it off. There were no therapy dogs, no decompression periods, no TikToks to vent into, just a grin, a cigarette, and the quiet unravelling of sanity. And as the clouds roll in and the mud reaches your ankles again, you realise something. You haven't heard your own real thoughts in days, just static, echoes, the occasional irrational urge to punch a tree, and that, perhaps more than anything, is what it meant to win the war. You came home, but your mind never did. And if you thought losing your sanity on the battlefield was bad, it was nothing compared to what happened when you had to answer nature's call. Because the true horror of soldier life was not the artillery, or the endless drills, or even the questionable coffee. It was the latrine. You're perched awkwardly over a rough wooden plank, your trousers around your ankles, the smell of ammonia so sharp it feels like someone is peeling the inside of your nose with a knife. You notice the buzzing first, flies swarming like fighter planes over the pit below. You feel your stomach twist in rebellion. but not from fear of combat. No, this is a different kind of terror entirely. The kind that comes from realizing you may actually faint before you finish. Historically, the military did not treat toilets as luxuries. In the Second World War, sanitary facilities was a term used more optimistically than literally. Most latrines were nothing more than long pits dug into the ground, sometimes with wooden seats balanced across the trench, sometimes just open holes. Soldiers nicknamed them thunderboxes or bomb sites, though not because they were impressed by the craftsmanship. Latrines often overflowed within days, seeping into the soil and water supply, creating not only misery but medical emergencies. Dysentery, cholera and typhoid were not abstract threats, they were daily companions. American Army records from 1942 to 1945 show that gastrointestinal disease accounted for nearly 1/5 of all medical evacuations from the front. Let that sink in. Soldiers were more likely to be taken out by diarrhea than by bullets, and yet the latrines were rarely managed with the kind of urgency you might expect from a force trying to preserve manpower. Commanders treated sanitation as an afterthought. Soldiers were expected to dig trenches, fill them when they overflowed, and then start over. As though morale could withstand the smell of 1,000 desperate men piled into a shallow pit of regret. Privacy was non-existent. Lines of soldiers often waited shoulder to shoulder, shifting in mud, rain or snow, while artillery rattled in the distance. You could be mid-squat when a mortar landed close enough to throw mud into your lap. In those moments, you did not feel heroic. You felt like a man praying to every saint and sanitation officer alive that the splash would not reach you. And then there was the toilet paper situation. It was not so much rationed as it was mythical. Soldiers wiped with whatever was at hand. Newspapers, propaganda leaflets, leaves, and in some desert campaigns, even sand. Medical notes from British forces in North Africa mention rashes so severe they required bandages after wiping. Imagine writing home about that injury. Imagine explaining to your family that you survived a German ambush only to be hospitalised because you scrubbed yourself raw with desert grit. Humour became the only defence. Soldiers carved graffiti into toilet walls, drew crude cartoons of generals, or balanced helmets on sticks to mark the good seats. One common joke was that the latrine was where you truly met the enemy. Not in combat, but in the trench, battling bacteria and fellow soldiers for the least horrifying spot. But the true psychological strain was not just filth. It was the erosion of dignity. You could handle mud, cold, and hunger, but defecating inches from another man, both of you trying to pretend it was normal, chipped away at the very concept of privacy. Military psychologists later noted that lack of privacy was one of the biggest mental stresses in long campaigns, and the latrine was ground zero. Diseases spread, yes. Morale crumbled, yes. But what lingered most was the sense that you had lost all ownership over your body. You did not control when or where you relieved yourself. You did not control what you wiped with. The latrine became a symbol of the larger war, dehumanizing, relentless, and always worse than anyone admitted. And as you shift uncomfortably on the rickety plank, listening to the splash below echo like some grotesque symphony, you realize something. This pit is not just sewage. It is a graveyard of sanity. Every soldier who steps here leaves behind more than waste. They leave behind a little piece of their mind. But if you think the toilets were bad, wait until you find out what happened when the food arrived. Because sometimes, the latrine was only the beginning of the real madness. And as you shuffle out of the latrine with dignity clinging to you by a thread, your stomach growls in rebellion, which is unfortunate because the cure is almost as bad as the disease. Now it is time to face the other slow weapon of madness in World War II, the rations. You're sitting in a muddy clearing with a dented tin can in your hands, the label long since peeled away by rain and handling. You notice the faint metallic tang of spoiled meat even before you pry the lid open. You feel your throat tighten at the sight of the gelatinous grey lump inside. This is dinner, or breakfast, or both. The army never cared enough to explain. Soldiers in World War II ate what were officially called field rations. In practice, these were experimental torture devices disguised as food. The American forces had their famous K rations, designed by an army nutritionist who claimed they contained the perfect balance of calories and vitamins. On paper, it was a marvel of military planning. In reality, it was like chewing on chalky dog biscuits soaked in tin juice. Each K-ration box contained a can of processed meat, some crackers hard enough to double as body armour, a packet of powdered coffee, a piece of gum, and occasionally, if the logistics officer was feeling generous, a square of chocolate. The chocolate, however, was not normal chocolate. It was designed not to melt in heat, which meant it also did not melt in your mouth. Soldiers called it Hitler's secret weapon, because eating it often caused cramps and nausea. Imagine Willy Wonka opening a factory in a nightmare. That was military chocolate. The British had their own version, called Compo Rations, short for composite. Each pack was intended to feed 14 men for one day. It contained tinned stew, canned bacon, hard biscuits, and powdered tea. By the end of the war, many British soldiers swore they could never look at canned bacon again without gagging. Canadian troops joked that their rations tasted like home, if home had burned down and been scraped into a tin. And then there were the Germans. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on something called the Iron Ration. This was a sealed package of meat, bread, and coffee substitutes that soldiers were only supposed to eat in emergencies. The problem was, emergencies never stopped, so they ate it constantly. German rations were notoriously short on vitamins, leading to mass cases of scurvy and other deficiencies. It is one thing to fight a global war. It is another thing to fight it while your gums bleed from lack of oranges. Food became more than sustenance. It became obsession. Soldiers traded, gambled, and fought over rations like misers clutching gold. In the American lines, cigarettes were the real currency, but cans of Spam and chocolate were not far behind. The black market flourished in every theatre. A tin of pineapple chunks could fetch favours, protection, or enough cigarettes to last a week. In Italy, some soldiers used rations to bribe civilians. In the Pacific, they were used to barter with locals. The stomach was an economy of its own. What no one talks about is the mental toll of monotony. Eating the same flavourless mush every single day wears on the mind as much as the body. Psychologists studying veterans after the war noted that food complaints were one of the most common themes in diaries and letters. Not fear of combat, not homesickness, not even missing family. Food. Endless complaints about food. A body can survive on Spam and powdered coffee. A mind cannot. And then there was the nightmare of sea rations. These were bulkier, heavier, and filled with canned entrees like beef stew or ham and lima beans. The infamous ham and lima beans became so hated that soldiers called it ham and motherese and would rather go hungry than eat it. Countless veterans claimed the smell alone was enough to make them gag decades later. Lima beans became more feared than enemy artillery. Diseases of the gut were constant companions. Rancid food spoiled in the heat of the tropics. Powdered eggs turned green when reconstituted. Water supplies were often contaminated, meaning soldiers drank coffee and tea not for pleasure, but as a safer substitute for water. Coffee was served lukewarm and bitter, made with water that had the flavour of rusted helmets. The caffeine helped keep men awake, but the taste haunted them like a bad dream. There were attempts at culinary creativity. Soldiers mixed chocolate with instant coffee powder to make a gritty drink called mocha sludge. They crushed crackers into cans of stew to thicken them. They poured condensed milk over biscuits and pretended it was dessert. In rare moments, soldiers near supply depots could trade for fresh eggs or bread, and the morale boost was immediate. Nothing lifted spirits faster than real food. Which explains why so much soldier folklore centres not on battles but on meals. The humour was bleak. Soldiers joked that canned meat came from animals that had died of the old age, that the crackers were baked during the last war and dug up for this one, that the powdered coffee was actually ground up shoe polish. In letters home, many exaggerated their meals to make them sound even worse, not because they wanted pity, but because it was the only way to laugh at the absurdity of living off industrial sludge while fighting for freedom. The tragedy was that hunger broke men down faster than bullets. Malnutrition left soldiers weak, their minds foggy, their tempers short. Starvation was a constant spectre in prisoner of war camps. The Japanese rationed POWs at a fraction of normal intake, leading to mass death by starvation and disease. German soldiers cut horse meat from dead cavalry. Russian soldiers boiled leather belts for broth. The human brain simply cannot stay stable when the stomach is empty. And as you scrape the last spoonful of grey stew into your mouth, feeling your taste buds retreat like deserters, you realise something. It is not just that the food is bad, it is that the food is relentless. It never ends. It is the same meal in the same tin with the same taste every single day until you forget what hunger even feels like. Because now you are never hungry. You're only nauseous. Yeah, and if you think meals like this could break your spirit, wait until you learn what happened when the army messed with your sleep. Because the mind can handle a bad meal, but it cannot handle never closing its eyes. And as the taste of powdered coffee lingers like burnt regret on your tongue, you realise that the army's solution to bad food was not better food. It was more caffeine, which meant you were expected to stay awake long past the point of sanity. Because in World War II, sleep was treated as a luxury, a weakness, something soldiers could sacrifice the same way they sacrifice clean socks or intact hearing. You're lying in a foxhole, your body vibrating from the cold mud pressing into your back. You notice the distant thump of artillery, not close enough to be fatal, but always close enough to keep your nerves on edge. You feel your eyelids droop, then snap open again, because sleep is never safe here. At any moment, a shout, a shell, or the simple paranoia of being watched will wrench you back into consciousness. Historically, armies underestimated the value of sleep until it was almost too late. World War II was fought on fronts that stretched across continents, from deserts to jungles to frozen forests, and soldiers were often forced to operate with only 1 or 2 hours of rest in a 24-hour period. Combat fatigue was not just a figure of speech, it was a medical condition. Military doctors recorded cases of men hallucinating, collapsing mid-march, or breaking down into incoherent rambling after days without sleep. In 1944, the US Army's own psychiatric division admitted that sleep loss was one of the primary causes of what they politely called war neuroses. Translation: losing your mind. Studies showed that after 72 hours without proper rest, soldiers became as impaired as if they were drunk. They staggered, they slurred, they fired weapons at shadows. But unlike alcohol, there was no morning after to recover. There was just more war. The British Army had an expression for it. The 1,000-yard stare. Eyes wide open, unfocused, gazing into some invisible horizon only they could see. A face drained of emotion, locked in perpetual exhaustion. Photographers captured it in countless portraits. Soldiers who looked alive but not truly present. Sleep deprivation had hollowed them out from the inside. The Germans faced the same problem but often dealt with it by issuing stimulants. The Wehrmacht distributed millions of tablets of Pervitin, a methamphetamine marketed as a wakefulness aid. Pilots, tank crews and infantry were instructed to use it during long operations. At first, it worked brilliantly. Soldiers could march for days without rest, fight through exhaustion, and still feel alert. But the crash came quickly. Addiction, paranoia, and hallucinations set in. There are accounts of entire German units losing cohesion because they had been awake too long, fueled only by meth and desperation. The Japanese also embraced stimulants, using a version of methamphetamine called Philopon. It was given to kamikaze pilots before their missions to heighten focus and erase fear. But beyond the suicide attacks, ordinary soldiers received doses too. Post-war, Japan faced a massive addiction crisis as leftover supplies flooded civilian markets. The war did not end when the guns went silent. It lingered in sleepless, trembling bodies for decades. Americans relied heavily on caffeine. Coffee was a staple of every ration kit, often consumed cold, bitter and gritty, sometimes brewed with water scooped straight from puddles. In the Pacific, soldiers joked that the jungle ran on mosquitoes and instant coffee. In Europe, men boiled socks in their coffee pots just to keep the water warm. The joke was that the caffeine was strong enough to dissolve spoons, but no matter how much they drank, it was never enough to cancel the debt of exhaustion. Sleep deprivation warped the mind in subtle ways. A soldier who had not slept for days became irritable, paranoid, and reckless. Friendships collapsed into shouting matches. Orders were misheard or ignored. Some men swore they saw phantom lights in the woods or heard voices whispering from the mud. Military psychiatrists documented cases of soldiers insisting that the enemy was crawling over them in the night when nothing was there. One American medic wrote in his diary that half his patients were not wounded by bullets, but by insomnia. The army tried to mitigate the damage with rest areas. These were camps where soldiers rotated out of the front lines for a few days of relative quiet. But rest areas were often located within earshot of artillery, and the beds were nothing more than wooden planks or hay sacks. Men were too wired to truly sleep. One British officer quipped that rest camps were where soldiers practiced staying awake more comfortably. The consequences rippled across the war. Entire offensives were shaped by exhaustion. During the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, Allied soldiers marched and fought in freezing conditions with little sleep for weeks. Commanders reported units breaking down, not from enemy fire but from sheer fatigue. German diaries from the same campaign tell the same story. Both sides were locked in a battle not just against each other but against the collapse of their own bodies. And then there were the prisoners of war. Sleep deprivation became a tool of torture. Captors forced men to stand for days, denied them rest, or woke them repeatedly to erode their willpower. Many prisoners later recalled the lack of sleep as more unbearable than beatings. The body heals from bruises. The brain does not easily heal from sleeplessness. Humour, as always, crept in as a defence. Soldiers joked that they had not closed their eyes since basic training, that they were fighting both the enemy and the Sandman, that their eyelids had gone AWOL. One common prank was to balance a helmet on a snoring comrade's chest, so he woke up convinced the world was collapsing. It was cruel, yes, but laughter was one of the few weapons left against exhaustion. And as you lie there in your foxhole, your body trembling between wakefulness and collapse, you realise something. The war does not need to kill you outright. It just needs to keep you awake long enough for your mind to fall apart on its own. Because without sleep, every shadow is an enemy, every whisper is a threat, and every thought is a betrayal. But if sleepless nights shredded sanity, the constant infestation of lice, fleas, and bedbugs finished the job. Because nothing says psychological warfare like an army of parasites crawling through your uniform while you pretend not to scream. And as you shift in the mud, trying to snatch a few minutes of rest that never comes, you feel it. That unmistakable crawling itch along your scalp, another along your collar. You scratch, and it only gets worse. You're not fighting the enemy tonight, you're fighting an army of parasites that has already won. Every soldier in World War II was drafted into this secondary war, a conflict fought in uniforms, blankets and hairlines. Lice were as constant as boots and helmets. Fleas were seasonal, but equally relentless. Bedbugs thrived in barracks and bunkhouses. The army might have trained you to survive bullets, but it never really trained you to survive the sensation of 1,000 tiny legs marching across your skin while you tried to aim a rifle. Historically, the problem was enormous. In 1943, the US Army estimated that nearly every frontline soldier had been infested with lice at some point. The British Army reported entire units rendered combat ineffective because of louse-borne fatigue. The Germans, despite their reputation for discipline, were not spared either. Lice were universal, indiscriminate and undefeated. The danger was not just discomfort. Lice carried typhus, a disease that had already devastated armies in previous wars. During World War I, typhus had killed millions. In World War II, it threatened to do the same. Refugee camps, prisoner of war camps, and Eastern Front trenches were hotbeds of outbreaks. In 1942, an epidemic swept through German-occupied Poland, killing thousands. The Allies dreaded it reaching their own ranks. It was not fear of bullets that haunted commanders. It was fear of a microscopic assassin hitching a ride in seams of clothing. The solution was DDT. This insecticide was hailed as a miracle. Soldiers were dusted with it in powder form, their uniforms soaked, their barracks sprayed until every surface stank of chemicals. The United States used DDT extensively in Italy in 1943 to control a typhus outbreak. Entire villages were dusted, children coated head to toe in white powder, as though they were being prepared for baking. It worked, at least in the short term, suppressing typhus and controlling lice. But it left a legacy of chemical contamination that would not be fully understood until decades later. Still, lice thrived. Soldiers joked that lice were their true companions. Nicknames like seam squirrels and trench pets spread across the ranks. Men spent hours delousing each other with candles or lighters, holding seams of clothing close to the flame to watch the insects pop. It was gruesome entertainment, but when you had nothing else to do, it was as close as you got to sport. Fleas made their presence known, especially in the Pacific. Jungle environments teemed with biting insects. Soldiers slept on mats only to wake covered in welts. Mosquitoes added their own torment, carrying malaria and dengue fever. Fleas thrived in dugouts where damp blankets and rotting vegetation offered a paradise of pestilence. In diaries, soldiers described scratching themselves bloody, unable to concentrate on orders because the itch consumed them more thoroughly than fear. Bedbugs were the quieter tormentors. Barracks, transport ships, and prisoner bunks crawled with them. Unlike lice, bedbugs struck at night, feeding on blood as soldiers tried in vain to sleep. Men would wake covered in red welts, convinced they had contracted a new disease, only to discover it was the familiar curse of bedbugs. For men already deprived of rest, this was another nail in the coffin of sanity. The humour soldiers invented to cope was dark. Men wrote poems about their loyal lice companions. They gave their infestations names. One American private joked that his lice had achieved officer rank. Another claimed the fleas were unionizing for better hours. If the army did not recognize their suffering, at least their imagination did. The psychological toll was immense. Constant itching meant constant distraction. The inability to stay clean eroded morale. Soldiers who had once marched into combat with steel in their eyes found themselves whimpering as they scratched at their waistbands. Medical officers warned that untreated infestations led to secondary infections, rashes, and even gangrene in extreme cases. But treatment was often as simple as soap and hot water, luxuries frontline soldiers rarely enjoyed. Clothing became both weapon and prison. Wool uniforms soaked in sweat created perfect habitats for lice. Soldiers boiled their clothes when they could, but more often simply wore the same infested fabric for weeks. In winter campaigns, removing clothing was impossible without risking frostbite, which meant lice enjoyed uninterrupted feasts. The Red Army on the Eastern Front called their lice the real Soviets because they lived in collective unity, never abandoning the motherland of the human body. And then there were the prisoners. In German camps, lice ran rampant through overcrowded huts. The Nazis, obsessed with hygiene in ideology but not in practice, allowed infestations to fester. Prisoners weakened by malnutrition had no defense. Typhus swept through camps like wildfire. In 1945, as the Allies liberated concentration camps, they found not only skeletal survivors, but infestations so severe that even liberating soldiers were horrified. One British officer wrote that the lice outnumbered the living. The irony was brutal. Armies spent fortunes on tanks, planes, and bombs, yet could not rid themselves of insects. Soldiers half joked that the real victors of the war would be lice, and in a way they were right. Parasites thrive no matter which flag flew overhead. And as you scratch again, Feeling the skin under your collar raw from irritation, you realize something. The enemy does not always fire bullets. Sometimes it crawls into your uniform, drinks your blood, and waits patiently as you unravel from within. But if lice could destroy your sanity slowly, the mud of the battlefield did it all at once, because when the ground itself turned against you, there was nowhere left to stand. And as you claw at your collar in vain, the itch still crawling over your skin like phantom fingers, the earth beneath you begins to ooze. The ground itself is not a surface anymore. It is a living, sucking enemy. You're not just fighting soldiers, you're fighting mud. Mud was one of the most unrelenting weapons of World War II. It swallowed boots, clogged rifles, and drained sanity. Soldiers on nearly every front faced it, though each landscape gave the muck its own particular flavour of misery. In the Russian steppe it was called Rasputitsa, the infamous seasonal mud that reduced entire mechanised divisions into bogged-down statues. In Western Europe it filled foxholes until men slept half-submerged in brown soup. In the Pacific it rotted flesh from the feet upward, turning soldiers into victims of their own trenches. You notice it first as a dampness in your socks, then a cold seeping through your soles, then the slow, unshakable realization that your boots are no longer boots but anchors. You feel the mud grip you like quicksand, tugging with every step until even walking becomes a negotiation with the earth. The Germans on the Eastern Front wrote endlessly about it. Tanks stuck axle deep, horses collapsing in exhaustion, men forced to drag artillery pieces through fields that resembled lakes. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg was designed for speed, but in mud, even the most disciplined soldier crawled at a snail's pace. The Americans fared no better in France. During the winter of 1944, soldiers described sleeping in foxholes filled with icy sludge, their blankets soaked, their uniforms stiff with frozen dirt. One GI joked that the mud had achieved a kind of sentience, sneaking into his socks at night to keep him company. Another recorded that he had not seen the colour of his own skin in weeks, only layers of filth that never washed away. Mud was not only discomfort, it was a weapon against equipment. Rifles jammed, trucks stalled, and radios shorted out when water seeped into their casings. Soldiers spent hours cleaning weapons only to find them clogged again within minutes. In diaries, many admitted that the fear of their guns misfiring because of mud was worse than the fear of being shot outright. It is one thing to face an enemy. It is another thing to face him with a weapon that sneezes instead of fires. The psychological toll was immense. Mud blurred the line between soldier and swamp. Men lived in it, ate in it, sometimes even died in it. Corpses sank into boggy soil, reappearing days later when the water shifted. In the Pacific, the humidity mixed with muck to breed infections. Jungle rot turned feet into festering wounds, the skin sloughing off as if boiled. Soldiers who could march for miles on dry land collapsed after days wading through endless sludge. And yet, humour found a way. Soldiers called themselves mud turtles and competed to see whose boots could pull free with the loudest suction noise. One common joke was that the mud had more confirmed kills than the enemy. A British unit in Italy referred to its camp as Lake Misery, and even gave out mock swimming awards for men who fell into the deepest pits. Gallows humour was all that kept the sludge from breaking them completely. History remembers the great battles, but often forgets the environment that dictated their pace. Rasputitsa in Russia halted German offensives long enough for Soviet counterattacks to regroup. Mud in Italy slowed Allied advances to a crawl, turning what should have been quick victories into drawn-out slogs. Even D-Day, remembered for its heroism on the beaches, was followed by weeks of fighting in the waterlogged Norman bocage. Soldiers were not sprinting into glory, they were dragging themselves knee-deep in filth, wondering if their socks would ever dry again. The smell was unforgettable. Rotting vegetation, unwashed bodies, and stagnant water combined into a stench that clung to uniforms. One veteran recalled that even when he came home, he could smell mud every time it rained. Another swore he had dreams of trying to run while the ground held him in place. The war had ended, but the muck had already seeped into memory. It is easy to underestimate filth until you live inside it. The body never dries, so rashes spread. Clothes never clean, so lice thrive. Boots never breathe, so fungus blooms. Soldiers carried all of this not for days, but for months. The filth did not leave when they left the front. It came home with them, lodged in skin, in lungs, in the folds of memory where no amount of soap could scrub it out. And as you sit now, your hands caked, your uniform stiff, the mud creeping further up your legs, you realise something. The ground itself has become the battlefield, and it is winning. Because while the enemy fires bullets, the earth does not stop. It only swallows. But if you thought the mud was merciless, wait until you find out what happened when the weather turned against you. Because nothing shreds sanity faster than fighting a war in climates designed to kill you before the enemy does. And as the mud swallows your boots with a squelch that sounds almost gleeful, the sky opens above you. Rain lashes sideways, wind howls through your already torn uniform, and the earth turns from sludge into flood. You're not just fighting mud now, you're fighting the weather itself. World War II was as much a war against climate as it was against nations. Soldiers did not march across pristine landscapes. They froze in Russia, drowned in France, roasted in North Africa, and wilted in the jungles of the Pacific. If bullets did not drive men to madness, the sheer hostility of the natural world finished the job. On the Eastern Front, cold was the most merciless enemy. German soldiers marching on Moscow in 1941 were issued summer uniforms. The assumption was that the campaign would be over by winter. It was not. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Engines froze solid. Oil congealed in tanks. Soldiers' boots stiffened like planks. Men urinated on rifle bolts to thaw them, only to have the liquid freeze moments later. Eyelids froze shut. Noses blackened. Thousands of soldiers were lost not to Soviet bullets but to frostbite. The Red Army did not escape either. Soviet soldiers endured the same cold in threadbare clothing, their only advantage being experience with brutal winters. Diaries from Russian troops described sleeping in snow burrows, drinking melted ice for water, and warming hands over the bodies of fallen comrades. Cold was democratic. It shredded sanity on both sides. In the Pacific, the opposite reigned. Jungle heat steamed the body until it became a swamp of its own. Uniforms never dried. Sweat mixed with mildew until clothing rotted on the skin. Soldiers developed prickly heat rashes that spread like wildfire. Some itched so badly they begged to be reassigned. Others fainted from dehydration while standing guard. One American medic recorded more cases of heat exhaustion than combat injuries in his unit. The Japanese fared no better. Their light uniforms were designed for mobility, not survival in a climate that felt like living inside a wet furnace. Rain was a universal torment. In New Guinea, downpours turned camps into rivers overnight. Soldiers woke to find their tents floating. In Normandy, rain filled foxholes until men were half submerged for days. Waterlogged feet swelled, cracked, and rotted. The term trench foot, born in World War I, returned with a vengeance. Men who could storm a machine gun nest collapsed weeping because their toes had turned black and their boots squelched with pus. The Mediterranean front brought its own absurdities. In North Africa, soldiers battled dust storms that blinded convoys, jammed weapons and buried equipment in dunes. Sand got into everything, grinding between teeth, clogging ears, coating skin until men looked like walking statues. British troops in the desert joked that they were less afraid of German panzers than of their daily ration of sand sandwiches. Climate shaped strategy as much as generals did. The D-Day invasion was delayed by storms. Patton's advance in France bogged down in rain. Japanese defences in Burma relied as much on monsoon mud as on bullets. Weather was not a backdrop, it was an active participant. And through all of this, soldiers tried to laugh. Americans in the Ardennes joked that the snow was so deep they could finally hide from officers. Germans cursed the Rasputitsa mud so much they invented new swear words. British soldiers in North Africa called their camp latrines sand castles. Humour was the only shield left when the sky itself wanted you gone. The psychological weight was immense. Constant exposure to the elements stripped men of illusions about glory. Nothing heroic feels possible when your socks are frozen to your skin, or when sweat pours off you faster than you can drink. Men did not break because of fear alone. They broke because they were never dry, never warm, never cool, never comfortable. Their bodies were tested until their minds followed. And as you sit now, rain dripping from your helmet into your already soaked collar, you realise something. The enemy does not have to aim a rifle. The weather does the job for them. It chips away at your body until you're too numb, too blistered, too feverish to care whether you live or die. But if the climate could erode sanity, the noise finished the job. Because once the sky started screaming with artillery, there was no silence left to return to. And as the rain soaks through your uniform and the mud creeps further up your legs, the silence ends. A single distant boom rolls across the horizon, followed by another, then another, until the sky itself seems to split apart. You're not just wet and cold anymore, you're vibrating. Because now the noise has arrived. World War II was the loudest event humanity had ever created. Artillery was the king of battle, and with it came a constant soundtrack of explosions, gunfire, and machinery. The human brain, built for birdsong and conversation, was never designed to endure the endless roar of industrial warfare. The result was not just deafness, it was madness. You notice it first as a ringing in your ears that never quite goes away. Veterans called it battlefield tinnitus. The ringing grew louder after every shelling, until silence itself felt impossible. You feel your chest rattle with each detonation, your teeth clattering in rhythm with weapons miles away. Even when the guns stop, the echoes remain inside your skull, bouncing around like trapped bees. Historically, artillery accounted for the majority of casualties in the war. In some campaigns, up to 70% of deaths and injuries came from shell fire. But for those who survived the blasts, the psychological impact was equally devastating. The constant threat of incoming rounds created what medical officers called anticipatory dread. Every whistle of a shell could mean nothing, or it could mean obliteration. The brain never relaxed. It existed in a permanent state of waiting for impact. This was not new. World War I had given the world the phrase shell shock, describing men who trembled uncontrollably, stuttered, or collapsed after long exposure to bombardment. In World War II, the condition was renamed combat fatigue, but the symptoms were the same. Men broke down after days or weeks under artillery barrages. They became jumpy, paranoid, and sleepless. Some reported feeling as though time itself had stopped, trapped in an endless thunderstorm of explosions. Noise did not end with artillery. Machine guns chattered without pause. Tanks ground forward with engines that rattled teeth. Planes screamed overhead, their engines producing decibels high enough to cause temporary deafness. One US Army study found that men in tank crews often suffered hearing loss, equivalent to standing next to a jackhammer for years. The Pacific Theatre added its own unique symphony. Jungle warfare meant sudden bursts of sound in an otherwise oppressive silence. A single rifle shot echoed like thunder. Grenades cracked among trees magnified by the canopy. Soldiers described the jungle as a place where every sound was amplified and every silence was suspicious. A bird call might be harmless, or it might be the signal for an ambush. And then there were the bombs. Cities across Europe and Asia endured air raids that shook the ground for hours. Civilians and soldiers alike lived under skies that rained steel. Survivors recalled the shriek of bombs as the most terrifying sound of the war. One British veteran said the worst part was not knowing whether the whistle meant it would hit you or someone else. The randomness of it gnawed at the mind. The psychological toll of noise was immense. Soldiers became hypervigilant, reacting to slamming doors or clattering pans long after the war ended. Veterans flinched at fireworks, mistook car backfires for gunfire, and lived with the phantom sounds of artillery decades after the last shot was fired. Psychologists now call it post-traumatic stress, but at the time it was dismissed as weakness. Men were told to toughen up, even as their ears bled and their hands shook from invisible echoes. Humour, as always, crept in as a shield. Soldiers gave nicknames to artillery pieces, calling them moaning minis or screaming mimes. They joked that the shells had personalities, that some were angry, some playful, some just bored. American troops claimed they could tell German artillery from their own by the pitch of the whistle. It was not science, but when your survival seemed to hinge on sound, imagination filled the gaps. Noise also destroyed communication. Orders were shouted, misheard, or lost entirely under the roar of battle. Radios crackled, voices were drowned, and hand signals vanished in smoke. Chaos thrived in the soundscape. Some men fired blindly, convinced the noise meant the enemy was closer than he was. Others froze, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of destruction. And as you sit there, ears ringing, skull rattling, every muscle tensed for impact, you realize something. The war is not just fought with weapons, it is fought with decibels. The sound itself becomes a weapon, hammering sanity until even silence feels dangerous. Because once the guns finally stop, the quiet does not bring peace, it brings memory. But if noise could shred the mind, so could its opposite. Because when the guns went quiet and the war paused, the boredom set in. And that was its own kind of madness. And when the guns finally fall silent and the ringing in your ears fades to a dull hum, the war reveals another weapon. Nothing. The crushing, mind-numbing emptiness of hours, days, sometimes weeks, with no fighting, no marching, and no end in sight. Because while movies make war look like a constant storm of action, most soldiers discovered it was an endless swamp of boredom. You're sitting on an overturned crate, your rifle balanced across your lap, staring at a patch of sky that does not change. You notice the dust motes floating in the sunlight, moving slower than you thought possible. You feel your thoughts stretch out like taffy, thinning and warping until you start to wonder if time itself has surrendered. Historically, soldiers in World War II spent the majority of their service not in combat, but in waiting. Studies after the war reveal that even frontline troops only saw about 60 days of actual combat in a year. The rest was spent digging trenches, standing guard, cleaning equipment, or simply sitting with nothing to do. The irony was brutal. Men had been shipped across oceans to fight in the largest conflict in human history, only to spend most of it staring at mud or counting clouds. This boredom was not harmless. Military psychologists called it monotony fatigue. Soldiers deprived of stimulation reported restlessness, irritability, and even hallucinations. Some developed compulsive habits, endlessly cleaning their rifles or rearranging their gear. Others gambled away every spare coin, turning boredom into addiction. In extreme cases, men snapped, lashing out at comrades or inventing imaginary enemies just to break the monotony. Commanders tried to counteract the problem with drills, endless repetitive drills, marching, saluting, cleaning, then repeating it all the next day. The intention was discipline. The result was a collective groan from soldiers who now had to endure both boredom and the absurdity of practicing how to fold socks to regulation length. An American private wrote in his diary that he spent more time polishing boots in England than he ever spent fighting Germans in France. Entertainment became a battlefield of its own. The US Army Special Services Division organised shows, bringing musicians, comedians and dancers to the troops. Bob Hope became a legend by joking in front of exhausted men who laughed harder than they had in months. The British relied on ENSA, their entertainment corps, to deliver theatre performances and concerts even in bombed-out ruins. Germans staged concerts with military bands, and Japanese forces encouraged sumo demonstrations to keep morale alive. But these diversions were rare. More often, soldiers invented their own amusements. Gambling with dice or cards was ubiquitous. Cigarettes served as poker chips. In Italy, soldiers bet on snail races. In North Africa, they carved chess pieces out of bone and played in the sand. In the Pacific, men tied strings to beetles and staged insect battles. The creativity was admirable. The desperation behind it was obvious. Letters home filled the empty hours, but even writing became monotonous. Many soldiers confessed to repeating themselves, sending the same reassurances week after week because they had nothing new to report. "I am fine. The weather is bad. The food is worse." Families often assumed their loved ones were hiding grim truths. In reality, they were hiding the fact that nothing was happening at all. The psychological weight of boredom cannot be overstated. When danger loomed, adrenaline kept men sharp. But when nothing happened, the brain turned inward. Every itch, every sound, every worry magnified. Soldiers obsessed over small irritations until they seemed unbearable. A squeaky boot, a crooked helmet strap, or a ration tin that rattled in a pack could provoke rage. The human brain craves variety. War provided the opposite. Humour, as always, rose to the surface. Soldiers staged fake parades, marching in ridiculous formations just to break the monotony. Others wrote parody newspapers filled with absurd headlines like "Mud declared official national dish" or "General issues order to stop snoring." Cartoons circulated mocking officers, rations and lice. These jokes were not trivial. They were lifelines, ways to stay sane when the hours stretched into an eternity. The danger of boredom was that it primed soldiers for collapse when combat finally returned. Men lulled into stupor were suddenly thrust into chaos, their reflexes dulled by inactivity. Military reports from both Allied and Axis forces warned that long idle stretches left troops less effective in battle. Paradoxically, boredom weakened soldiers more than fatigue. At least exhaustion had an explanation. Boredom had none. And then there was the sheer absurdity of guarding nothing. Soldiers stood watch over empty fields, silent roads, or abandoned villages. They stared into the dark for hours, nerves fraying until shadows moved on their own. Reports of phantom enemies were common. Entire units fired at bushes, convinced they had seen movement. Some even called for artillery support against targets that did not exist. In reality, it was boredom turning imagination into paranoia. And as you sit now, your legs numb from stillness, your thoughts circling like vultures, you realize something. War does not only break men through violence, it breaks them through absence, through the long, endless stretches of nothing that eat away at the mind until even silence feels unbearable. But if boredom eroded sanity slowly, the filth of human bodies crushed it daily. Because nothing reminded you of your own fragility quite like the smell of unwashed soldiers crammed together in spaces where hygiene had ceased to exist. And as the empty hours stretch on and your brain claws for stimulation, another problem rises up, thicker than fog and impossible to ignore. The smell. Not of gunpowder or mud, but of unwashed human beings crammed together in uniforms that have not seen soap in weeks. Because while the war was fought with bullets and bombs, it was lived in a haze of stench. You're crouched in a dugout, knees pressed to your chest, your uniform stiff with sweat and grime. You notice the sour tang of socks that have not been changed, the musky rot of boots that never dry, and the pungent cocktail of men who have forgotten what bathing even feels like. You feel your stomach churn as you breathe it in, realizing that this smell is not going anywhere. It is the perfume of war. Historically, hygiene was one of the greatest casualties of World War II. Soldiers often went weeks without bathing. Field conditions rarely allowed for regular washing, and water was usually reserved for drinking or cooking. Soap was rationed and supplies often ran out. Uniforms were worn until they rotted. Underwear became myth. Men scratched at their skin until it bled, then covered it with more dirt. Cleanliness was not a goal. Survival was. The British Army issued soap in rations, but soldiers joked that it was good only for carving into dice. American troops had better supply chains, but still went without bathing for weeks in combat zones. German soldiers often bathed in rivers when possible, But on the Eastern Front, rivers were frozen for much of the year. Japanese troops in the Pacific struggled with fungal infections in the humid climate. Hygiene was not cultural, it was environmental, and everywhere it was impossible. The smell became legendary. One veteran recalled that you could smell a platoon before you saw it. Another said the odour of unwashed men was worse than the stench of latrines, because at least the latrine was localised. Sweat, mildew, rot, and infection combined into a stench that clung to clothing and skin. Soldiers carried it with them like invisible banners. Body lice added to the misery. Without regular washing, infestations spread rapidly. Men picked lice from their seams, crushed them between fingernails, and joked about hosting louse rodeos. But laughter could not mask the constant itching, the sores, or the infections. Flea bites turned into rashes. Fungal growth bloomed between toes. One American medic wrote that the average soldier had more skin conditions than working body parts. Dental hygiene collapsed too. Toothbrushes were often lost or broken, and replacements were low on the priority list. Soldiers chewed gum or tobacco to mask the taste of rot in their mouths. Cavities went untreated, infections spread, and some men resorted to pulling their own teeth with pliers. A toothache might not seem like a battlefield threat, but in the trenches, it was enough to drive men to tears. Laundry was an ordeal. Clothing was rarely washed properly, often only rinsed in dirty water and hung to dry in damp air. Uniforms stiffened with sweat, mud, and blood. Socks became breeding grounds for fungus. The US Army eventually made clean socks a medical priority after trench foot rates soared. Soldiers were instructed to change socks daily, but when supplies failed, they simply rotated pairs of wet socks, hoping they would dry by magic. The psychological toll was heavy. Soldiers lost their sense of individuality under the layers of filth. Dirt blurred faces, uniforms, and identities. The smell became so constant that men stopped noticing it until they encountered civilians who recoiled. Many soldiers later recalled that the first bath after the war felt like rebirth, as if they had shed an entire other body they had been carrying for years. And yet, humour surfaced even here. Soldiers named their lice, joked that their socks were alive, and wrote letters home exaggerating their stench. British soldiers quipped that the Germans could track them by smell alone. Americans claimed the odour was their true secret weapon. Germans complained that Russian mud mixed with their sweat to create a stench that no amount of cologne could disguise. But the darker side of hygiene was disease. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, and trench fever spread through filth. Entire units were incapacitated not by bullets, but by fevers contracted from poor sanitation. Medical corps scrambled to provide delousing stations, soap, and disinfectant, but these were temporary solutions. The war was too vast, the conditions too harsh. The human body was simply not designed to endure years without proper cleaning. And as you sit now, your nose burning with the combined fumes of sweat, mildew, and regret, you realise something. This stench is not just unpleasant, it is transformative. It is the smell of identity dissolving, of men reduced to animals, of sanity slipping away with every unwashed day. But if the odour of war stripped soldiers of their humanity, the sight of constant death did the rest. Because once you lived surrounded by corpses, sanity was no longer guaranteed, and as the stench of unwashed bodies saturates the air until you no longer notice it, a new odour pushes through. Thick, metallic, and unmistakable. The smell of death. Because in war, the dead do not politely disappear. They stay. They lie in fields, in ditches, in foxholes, and sometimes right beside you. And soon, they stop being shocking. They simply become part of the scenery. You're crouched in a trench, your boot nudging against something soft that no longer resists. You notice the stillness first. A body propped where it fell, rain pooling in its uniform, eyes long since closed or never able to close at all. You feel your stomach turn, but not with fear, with resignation. Because this is your new neighbour. Historically, the presence of corpses was one of the most psychologically destructive aspects of World War II. On every front, soldiers lived among the dead. Battlefields were rarely cleared quickly. In the Pacific, tropical heat accelerated decomposition, turning bodies into bloated husks within days. In Russia, the cold preserved them, leaving frozen corpses scattered across fields like grotesque statues. In Western Europe, shifting front lines meant bodies often lay unburied for weeks. The war piled dead faster than they could be buried. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers described eating meals within sight of corpses, sleeping beside them, or using bodies as cover during firefights. One American private wrote that after a few days, the dead were no longer frightening. They were just obstacles. The true horror was not their presence, but the fact that you got used to it. The smell was unforgettable. Rotting flesh mixed with cordite and mud created an odour that veterans said clung to their nostrils for life. Flies swarmed over bodies in black clouds. Rats feasted openly, sometimes so bold they bit sleeping soldiers. Men covered their mouths with cloth or smeared menthol under their noses, but nothing masked it. Medical officers noted that prolonged exposure to decomposing bodies caused nausea, headaches, and in some cases fainting. But the bigger toll was mental. Soldiers became numb, detached. Their humanity eroded one corpse at a time. Disease was a constant threat. Decomposing bodies attracted vermin and contaminated water supplies. In the Pacific, malaria and dysentery spread in part because corpses polluted streams. On the Eastern Front, typhus epidemics often followed mass death. Armies tried to bury the dead quickly, but with limited manpower and constant fighting, the task was often impossible. Graves were shallow, hurried, and easily disturbed by shell fire. The result was a landscape of half-buried bodies, bones poking through mud, a grotesque reminder that the war had no clean-up crew. And then there was the grotesque practicality. Soldiers used corpses as shields, stacking them against trenches to block bullets. In winter, frozen bodies became macabre barricades. Diaries from both Allied and Axis soldiers record men propping rifles on corpses, sitting on them as makeshift benches, or draping blankets over them for cover. It was not cruelty, it was survival. But each act chipped away at the line between life and death until soldiers began to see themselves as temporary visitors among the fallen. Humour tried to soften the edges. Soldiers joked that corpses made reliable bunkmates because they did not snore. Others quipped that the dead were the only ones who truly obeyed orders. These jokes were not disrespect. They were the only way to cope with living in landscapes where bodies outnumbered trees. Photographic evidence confirms the scale. After the Battle of Stalingrad, streets were so littered with corpses that tanks simply rolled over them. In Normandy, American medics triaged wounded men beside piles of the dead. In the Philippines, entire battlefields became uninhabitable swamps of decay. Soldiers learned to walk without looking down too closely, because every step might land on something once human. The psychological fallout followed men home. Veterans reported recurring nightmares of corpses staring at them. Some admitted to feeling guilt not for killing, but for treating the dead like furniture. The numbness they developed to survive never fully faded. Civilian life seemed trivial after you'd spent months eating lunch while a corpse decomposed next to you. And as you sit there now, the smell of rot thick in your throat, you realise something. The true horror of war is not just dying. It is living among the dead until you forget what living even means. Because once you have shared your trench with corpses, sanity is already halfway gone. But if corpses stripped soldiers of their humanity, the injuries of the living often finish the job. Because nothing shattered minds faster than the constant sight of mangled comrades, screaming for help in places where help rarely arrived. And as the corpses around you sink deeper into mud and memory, a different sound rises. The groans of the not quite dead. The cries of men clinging to life in places where life had no business lingering. Because if living among corpses chipped away at sanity, watching the wounded writhe on battlefields shattered it completely. You're crouched beside a comrade who is still breathing, though barely. You notice the froth of blood at his lips, the pale tremor in his fingers, the eyes darting in panic because he knows what you know. That medicine here is not a cure. It is a gamble. You feel your stomach knot as the medic approaches, carrying supplies that look more like torture instruments than salvation. Historically, battlefield medicine in World War II was both astonishingly advanced for its time and utterly horrifying by modern standards. The war spurred innovations like penicillin, sulfur drugs, and blood plasma transfusions, saving millions of lives. But at the frontline level, soldiers witnessed suffering so raw it broke their perception of survival itself. To live often meant to live maimed, scarred, or haunted. Wounds were constant and grotesque. Shrapnel tore flesh into ribbons. Burns from flamethrowers left men unrecognisable. Bullets shattered bones that could not be repaired. The noise of battle was often drowned by the chorus of the injured crying for medics. But medics were few, their supplies limited, and their choices brutal. Triage meant deciding who might live and who was better left to die. Soldiers watched as comrades were passed over, left in the mud because their wounds were deemed beyond saving. That kind of decision carved into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Amputations were common. Field hospitals worked with speed, not finesse. Surgeons hacked off limbs with saws, sometimes without proper anaesthesia if supplies had run dry. Ether and morphine dulled pain but rarely erased it. The screams carried across tents and battlefields. Men woke up lighter, missing arms or legs, and sometimes screamed again when the reality set in. Others never woke at all. Infections were relentless. Before antibiotics became widespread, even minor wounds could fester into death sentences. Soldiers who survived bullets often succumbed to sepsis. Gangrene blackened flesh, forcing desperate amputations. Sulfur powder was poured into wounds, burning like fire but slowing bacterial spread. Penicillin, still in its infancy, was treated like liquid gold. Soldiers joked that it was easier to get a bullet than a shot of penicillin. Psychologically, the sight of the wounded warped minds. Soldiers confessed to feeling relief when comrades died quickly, because lingering injuries were worse to watch. Diaries describe men begging to be shot rather than left to suffer. Others describe the guilt of walking past the wounded to obey orders, the sounds of pleas chasing them into nightmares. The battlefield was not just a place of fighting, it was a hospital without walls, where everyone was both a soldier and a spectator to agony. The medics themselves became legends, but also broke under the strain, carrying stretchers through gunfire, dragging men from trenches, improvising surgeries in barns or tents. Their bravery saved thousands. Their trauma ruined thousands more. After the war, medics were among those most affected by what we now call PTSD, haunted by the faces of men they could not save. Humour, as usual, crept into the cracks. Soldiers joked that army medics carried more bandages than brains. Others claimed sulfur powder was seasoning for rations. Black humour compared amputation tents to carpentry shops. These jokes were not cruelty. They were shields, protecting fragile sanity from the horror of watching survival become its own curse. Civilians in bombed cities saw their own version. Londoners pulled survivors from rubble, burned and broken, their wounds treated in underground stations with little more than iodine and bandages. In Japan, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stumbled through streets with burns so severe their skin peeled away in sheets. Soldiers who later occupied those cities wrote that the sight of the living wounded was worse than seeing the dead. The dead were silent. The living made noise. And as you sit now watching the medic wrap a bandage that cannot possibly hold back the tide of blood, you realise something. War does not only kill, it leaves people alive in ways that feel worse than death, and being forced to watch, powerless, is its own form of insanity. But if wounded men broke your mind in the moment, the diseases that swept through armies broke it slowly, because nothing gnawed at morale more than the realization that you might not die from bullets at all, but from diarrhea in a ditch. And as the cries of the wounded fade into the mud and the medic's bandages unravel in your memory, a quieter killer makes its move. Not a bullet, not a shell, but a fever, a cough, a stomach cramp that turns into an evacuation order. Because in this war, the smallest enemies toppled the biggest armies. You're hunched over in a corner of the trench, your stomach twisting like barbed wire. You notice the sweat dripping into your eyes even though the air is cold. You feel the humiliation rising faster than the fever because you know the truth. You're not going to die a hero. You're going to die on the latrine plank taken out by dysentery. Historically, disease was one of the greatest threats of World War II. Despite modern medicine advancing rapidly, armies could not outrun the microbes that thrived in filth, mud, and overcrowded camps. In some theatres, disease claimed more manpower than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and trench fever were the uncredited commanders, shaping battles by deciding which units could even stand upright. Malaria was the undisputed king of tropical misery. In the Pacific, entire divisions were hobbled by the disease. The US Army reported that for every one soldier wounded by Japanese fire in New Guinea, 16 were incapacitated by malaria. Soldiers swallowed quinine or atibrin tablets daily, but the drugs left them nauseous and jaundiced, their skin turning yellow like wax figures. Men joked that the pills were more effective at ruining complexions than killing parasites. Dysentery, the polite term for weaponized diarrhea, swept through every front. Contaminated water and poor sanitation ensured that soldiers spent more time sprinting to latrines than fighting. One British medical officer estimated that half of his unit rotated through the trots at any given time. American soldiers referred to it as the G's Revenge. German troops on the Eastern Front called it the Russian Bullet because it struck more reliably than Soviet snipers. Typhus was the great terror of Eastern Europe. Spread by lice, it caused fevers, rashes, and delirium. Epidemics ripped through prisoner of war camps and occupied cities. In 1942, a typhus outbreak in Poland killed tens of thousands, prompting the Nazis to impose brutal quarantine measures. Ironically, the Allies controlled outbreaks more effectively by spraying DDT, coating civilians and soldiers alike in white powder until they looked like they had been dusted for baking. The sight of children lined up to be sprayed was surreal, but effective. Trenchfoot made its encore appearance, though technically it was not a disease but a condition. Prolonged exposure to wet and cold caused feet to swell, blister and rot. In Italy and northern France, hundreds of soldiers were evacuated because their toes turned black. The US Army launched sock change campaigns, insisting soldiers rotate pairs to keep feet dry. Men joked that their socks were more valuable than their rifles. The Japanese army faced its own horrors. With supply lines stretched, many troops resorted to eating whatever they could find. Starvation weakened immune systems, and diseases like beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiencies, ravaged entire units. Prisoners of war held by the Japanese suffered even worse, enduring cholera and dysentery in camps with little medical care. Survivors later testified that the diseases were more traumatic than the guards. Humour again emerged as defence. Soldiers gave nicknames to their afflictions. Malaria became jungle fever. Dysentery was the daily sprint. Typhus was lousy luck. Letters home often disguised sickness with jokes, assuring families that they were fine even while writing from hospital beds. The absurdity of armies collapsing not from combat, but from diarrhea was easier to laugh at than to accept. The impact of disease went beyond individual misery. Campaigns stalled because too many soldiers were incapacitated. In Burma, British and Indian troops fought not just the Japanese, but malaria rates so high that entire regiments were reduced to skeleton crews. In North Africa, sandfly fever left men bedridden for days. In the Pacific, Medical Corps calculated that disease had cost more combat days than enemy action. And yet modern medicine also scored victories. The mass production of penicillin during the war revolutionized treatment. Wounds that would have rotted in previous conflicts now healed. Pneumonia was no longer a death sentence. Sulfur drugs, though crude, saved thousands from infections. The war was a proving ground for medical science, but for the soldiers, progress meant little in the moment. They still endured the humiliation of diarrhea, the hallucinations of fever, and the exhaustion of parasites gnawing at their insides. And as you squat in the mud, your body convulsing with cramps while shells whistle overhead, you realise something. You're not afraid of dying in combat anymore. You're afraid of dying on the toilet, remembered forever as the man who lost the war to bacteria. But if sickness hollowed out armies one fever at a time, the constant strain of leadership and orders often finished the job. Because nothing shattered minds faster than realising that the people giving commands were often just as broken as the men obeying them. And as you clutch your stomach, still haunted by cramps that could topple armies, you look up and realise that your misery has a conductor. A man with a map, a pencil, and just enough distance from the front to imagine that all of this makes sense. Because if disease hollowed out your body, orders hollowed out your soul. You're standing in a field at dawn, the mud still wet from yesterday's storm. You notice your commander pointing at a map, as if the lines on the paper bear any resemblance to the swamp you're sinking in. You feel the absurdity rising, because he is explaining that you're to march 12 miles, dig a trench, hold it, and then abandon it tomorrow. Not because it matters, but because someone else, even farther away, decided it looks neat on a chart. Historically, World War II produced some of the most brilliant military minds of the century. But for every strategic genius, there were countless blunders, miscalculations, and outright delusions that soldiers paid for in blood. Orders filtered down through layers of bureaucracy until they bore no resemblance to the reality on the ground. Men learned quickly that leadership was as much a gamble as combat. The German army's obsession with holding territory at all costs left entire divisions trapped. In Stalingrad, commanders ordered soldiers to fight street by street, building by building, long after survival was impossible. Men froze, starved, and died not because they lacked courage, but because retreat was forbidden. One German private wrote that the true enemy was not the Soviets, but the refusal of his officers to admit the city was lost. The Allies had their own absurdities. American soldiers preparing for the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest in 1944 were told the terrain would not be a problem. The result was weeks of slaughter in dense woods where tanks bogged down, supply lines collapsed, and men froze to death under constant shelling. Veterans called it the meat grinder. The forest had no strategic value, yet tens of thousands suffered there because someone at a desk believed otherwise. British soldiers endured endless drills and regulations that often seemed detached from survival. In North Africa, men were ordered to wear full uniforms in desert heat, for the sake of discipline, leading to cases of heat stroke. In Burma, troops were sometimes forced to march in ceremonial order, through jungles filled with disease. Orders were not just commands, they were punishments disguised as structure. And then there was the Soviet system, where political officers shadowed commanders to enforce ideological loyalty. Soldiers who retreated without orders were sometimes shot by their own side. Stalin's infamous "not one step back" directive turned caution into treason. Men fought not only against the enemy but against their own commanders' paranoia. The madness of command was not limited to battlefields. Logistics became its own torment. Entire units were ordered to move supplies they did not need, guard empty warehouses, or march in circles because someone misread a map. American GIs joked that their true enemy was SNAFU, the acronym for Situation Normal, all fouled up. The humour was sharp because it was true. The psychological impact of bad leadership was devastating. Soldiers lost faith not just in commanders, but in the very purpose of the war. Letters home drip with sarcasm about absurd missions, wasted marches, and pointless drills. Some men confessed that they feared their officers more than enemy fire. Others admitted to following orders mechanically, shutting down mentally because to think about the stupidity was unbearable. Humour again became survival. Soldiers mocked officers behind their backs, drew caricatures in trench journals, and invented fake medals for absurd achievements like longest march to nowhere or best use of mud in a tactical retreat. One American unit even held mock trials for their commanders, convicting them of crimes like gross misuse of breakfast. The laughter covered the despair of realizing that insanity trickled down the chain of command. Yet history also records the rare commanders who preserved sanity, officers who bent orders to save lives, who prioritized rest, who shared rations with their men. Soldiers remembered these leaders with reverence long after the war. But for every decent officer, there were countless bureaucrats, martinet disciplinarians, and map-room dreamers whose decisions shredded morale. And as you stand now watching another line drawn on another map, you realize something. The war is not just fought against the enemy, it is fought against the very logic of command, against orders that make no sense, against decisions that bleed men dry for reasons no one at the front can see. But if orders from above drove you mad in daylight, the nights introduced something worse. Because when darkness fell and the war turned quiet, superstition and paranoia filled the void, and soldiers discovered that the human brain is perfectly capable of inventing new enemies out of shadows. And as the orders echo in your ears, the maps folded away, and the guns fall silent for the night, a new enemy crawls into the trench. It has no uniform, no rifle, no face. It is the imagination itself twisting shadows into soldiers and whispers into ghosts. Because when the war stopped making sense by day, superstition filled the gaps at night. You're lying in your foxhole, eyes wide open, the stars above obscured by drifting smoke. You notice the rustle of leaves nearby, louder than it should be, and the flicker of movement in the corner of your vision. You feel your chest tighten because you know the truth. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. Historically, soldiers in World War II were a deeply superstitious lot. It was not weakness, it was survival. When logic broke down under the weight of absurd orders and endless fear, ritual and paranoia became anchors. Men clutched lucky charms, refused to wear new boots in combat, or swore never to light 3 cigarettes on one match, a superstition dating back to World War I. The idea was that the glow of the 3rd cigarette gave the enemy enough time to aim. Whether or not it was true mattered less than the comfort it provided. Ghost stories thrived in every theatre. In the Pacific, soldiers spoke of jungle spirits that lured men off paths to their deaths. Some Marines swore they heard voices in the night, calling their names, only to find no one there. In Europe, ruined villages were said to be haunted by civilians killed in bombings. Soldiers on both sides reported seeing figures moving in fog, shapes that vanished when approached. The human brain, deprived of rest and assaulted by constant stress, conjured apparitions as easily as bullets. Paranoia was not just folklore, it had tactical consequences. Soldiers fired at shadows, wasting ammunition on bushes or animals. Reports of phantom enemies clogged radio channels. At night, entire units launched flares because someone swore they saw movement. In Italy, one Allied unit shelled a hillside for hours before discovering they had been fighting nothing but goats. The goats won by default. The Germans were particularly invested in ritual. Many soldiers carried charms, often religious medals or coins from home. Luftwaffe pilots sometimes refused to fly without their personal mascots, from teddy bears to carved figurines. The Japanese relied on cultural superstitions. Kamikaze pilots were given good luck sashes and believed ancestral spirits guided their planes. Even Soviet soldiers trained under an atheist state carried talismans or scribbled prayers in notebooks. Belief was universal because disbelief was unbearable. The psychological toll of paranoia was immense. Soldiers who lived in constant fear of the unseen grew twitchy, jumpy, and unpredictable. Military psychiatrists documented cases of combat neurosis, where men broke down not under shellfire but in silence, convinced they were being hunted by invisible enemies. Some refused to sleep, certain they would be attacked the moment they closed their eyes. Others insisted they heard footsteps behind them long after they'd been evacuated from the front. The humour of superstition softened the edge. American soldiers mocked each other's lucky charms, claiming that rabbits' feet had clearly belonged to unlucky rabbits. British troops joked that the real superstition was believing their rations were edible. Germans quipped that carrying medals was pointless when tanks could crush both man and mascot in one pass. But underneath the laughter lay dependence. No one dared abandon their rituals entirely. Cultural differences created absurd overlaps. In North Africa, Allied troops sometimes borrowed local beliefs about desert spirits, refusing to camp near certain dunes. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers accused Americans of being protected by supernatural forces because artillery barrages missed key positions. Americans, in turn, claimed Japanese night raids were guided by demons. Everyone projected their fears into folklore because folklore was easier to endure than reality. And as the night deepens and the shadows grow longer, you realise something. The war is not only fought with weapons or orders, it is fought in the mind, where every creak of a tree or whisper of wind becomes an enemy. Sanity does not need bullets to break, it only needs silence and imagination. But if superstition filled nights with ghosts, the arrival of actual technology often made things worse. Because when the machines of modern war arrived, soldiers discovered that being crushed by progress was sometimes more terrifying than being haunted by shadows. And as the shadows of superstition dissolve with the rising sun, the roar of engines replaces them. Metal replaces myth, gears replace ghosts, and the world reveals a new torment. Because if imagination drove men mad in the silence of night, technology did it in the daylight. You're standing beside a tank, its engine coughing black smoke into the air, the roar so loud it rattles your ribs. You notice the vibration under your boots, the ground humming as the machine prepares to move. You feel small, not just as a soldier but as a human, reduced to a cog in a system of machines that seem louder, hungrier, and more demanding than the men meant to command them. World War II was the most mechanized conflict humanity had ever unleashed. Tanks, planes, submarines, and trucks defined its battles. But these machines did not simply change strategy, they changed the psychological reality of soldiering. For many men, insanity came not from facing the enemy directly, but from being trapped inside the machines built to win the war. Tank crews lived in steel coffins. The average Sherman tank was a cramped furnace, holding 5 men in a space smaller than a bathroom. Temperatures inside could climb above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with fumes from fuel and gunpowder. Noise was constant, so loud that crews shouted inches from each other's faces. The claustrophobia was suffocating. One American tanker wrote that he would rather face bullets in the open than endure another day sealed inside what he called a rolling oven full of death. German tank crews suffered the same fate. The mighty Tiger tanks inspired fear on the battlefield, but inside conditions were just as miserable. Overheating, exhaust leaks, and endless mechanical breakdowns made them both prisons and workshops. Crews worked constantly to repair their machines, sometimes under fire. The psychological weight of knowing your survival depended on a temperamental engine was crushing. Air crews endured a different kind of torment. Bomber crews flew missions that lasted 8 to 10 hours, often at altitudes where temperatures dropped to 50 below zero. Frostbite was common, oxygen masks froze, and constant vibrations made bodies ache. The roar of engines never ceased. Gunners sat in glass turrets, exposed to the sky, waiting for enemy fighters to appear. The stress was so immense that the US Army Air Forces calculated bomber crews could only handle about 25 missions before mental collapse was likely. Submariners lived in conditions so claustrophobic that even tanks looked spacious by comparison. German U-boat crews crammed into vessels where bunks were shared in shifts. The air stank of diesel and sweat, and silence was broken only by the groan of hulls under pressure. Submarine service was nicknamed Iron Coffin Duty for good reason. Men lived weeks without sunlight, their sanity tested by both the silence of the deep and the constant fear of depth charges exploding overhead. Trucks and convoys brought their own misery. Long drives across endless terrain left drivers half asleep, their minds numbed by monotony. In Russia, convoys froze in place, engines dying in the cold. In North Africa, sand choked engines until drivers spent more time digging than driving. Vehicles were both lifelines and liabilities, and soldiers cursed them as often as they praised them. Technology was supposed to make war efficient, but for soldiers it often made it more absurd. Radios crackled with interference, leading to garbled orders that sometimes sent units marching in circles. Early radar systems misread flocks of birds as bombers, causing false alarms. Anti-aircraft guns were fired at phantom targets more often than real ones. The chaos of modern machines created new layers of confusion that men were forced to endure without question. Psychologically, the machines stripped soldiers of control. In earlier wars, men fought face to face. In World War II, they were trapped in cockpits, hulls and convoys, dependent on engines and electronics. When the machine failed, they failed. Soldiers became passengers in wars dictated by horsepower and fuel rather than individual will. For many, this lack of agency was maddening. Humour predictably bubbled up. Soldiers nicknamed their machines with affectionate or sarcastic titles. American bombers bore nose art of pin-up girls and cartoon characters as if laughter could ward off disaster. British tanks were given names like Churchill's Folly or the Coffin on Tracks. German crews cursed their temperamental vehicles with jokes about them being more dangerous to drivers than to enemies. Jokes did not fix engines, but they fixed morale, at least for a while. The psychological toll of mechanized war followed men home. Tank crews complained of phantom vibrations long after the war ended. Pilots reported hearing engine hums in silence, unable to sleep without imagining propellers spinning. Submariners struggled with claustrophobia, unable to ride elevators or sit in small rooms. The machines were not simply tools, they rewired minds. And as you stand now, listening to the roar of engines and feeling the ground tremble under steel treads, you realize something. The enemy is no longer just flesh and blood. It is the machine itself. A steel beast that demands obedience, sanity, and sometimes life, and gives back nothing but exhaust. But if machines drained sanity through their roar and confinement, the lies of propaganda finished the job. Because when every poster, broadcast, and headline insisted that everything was fine, soldiers knew the truth, and pretending otherwise was enough to make anyone lose their grip. And as the rumble of machines fades into the distance, you're left with silence filled not by truth, but by voices on the radio and slogans on the walls. The posters insist victory is certain. The speeches declare that the enemy is collapsing. The leaflets claim you are winning. But as you look down at your lice, your diarrhea, and the corpse still half buried beside your trench, you realize that propaganda has declared war on your sanity. You're squinting at a crumpled leaflet dropped from the sky, promising that the enemy has already surrendered. You notice the bold letters declaring that your side is strong, united, and fearless. You feel the laughter bubbling in your throat because none of it matches the mud under your boots or the fear in your gut. Historically, World War II was as much a propaganda war as it was a military one. Governments on all sides saturated their soldiers with posters, broadcasts, and films designed to inspire confidence. The United States had Why We Fight, a documentary series narrated with dramatic music and booming voices. Britain had the Ministry of Information, which plastered walls with slogans like "Keep calm and carry on," a phrase that sounded comforting in an office but absurd in a trench. Germany's Joseph Goebbels perfected the art of lying through radio, convincing soldiers that victory was inevitable even as the Reich collapsed around them. Japan filled the air with broadcasts about divine destiny, insisting that soldiers were guided by ancestral spirits while they marched without shoes. The disconnect between propaganda and reality was enough to unhinge even the strongest minds. Soldiers heard on the radio that their army was advancing, while their unit was retreating through mud. They read pamphlets promising good rations, then opened tins of spoiled meat. They were told morale was high, while watching comrades weep into their helmets. The lies were not subtle. They were painted in bright colours, shouted in speeches and broadcast daily. And the greater the gulf between truth and propaganda, the more corrosive it became. Enemy propaganda added another layer of absurdity. In the Pacific, Tokyo Rose, a group of English-speaking Japanese broadcasters, taunted Allied troops over the radio with exaggerated casualty reports and mocking songs. Soldiers listened anyway, partly for entertainment, partly because the boredom of camp made any broadcast irresistible. In Europe, Axis Sally delivered similar monologues, warning American soldiers that their wives were cheating on them back home. The lies were transparent, but they stuck, gnawing at already frayed nerves. The Soviets turned propaganda into artillery of the mind. Leaflets rained down on German troops, urging them to surrender. Loudspeakers blasted across no man's land at night, playing music or reading lists of captured soldiers' names. The goal was to remind the enemy that someone was always watching, always listening, and always ready to declare them lost. Many German soldiers admitted after the war that the psychological strain of hearing their own names broadcast from the darkness was more terrifying than incoming shells. Even within armies, propaganda created fractures. Soldiers mocked official slogans, carving them into latrine walls with sarcastic commentary. American GIs joked that "keep 'em flying" referred to mosquitoes more than planes. British troops twisted "careless talk costs lives" into "careless officers cost more." Humour became the only way to bridge the chasm between the optimism on posters and the misery in reality. The absurdity reached its peak when propaganda was forced to cover disasters. After the Battle of Arnhem, which ended in catastrophic Allied failure, reports emphasised heroic resistance rather than defeat. German propaganda declared Stalingrad a strategic withdrawal, even as their Sixth Army froze to death. Japanese broadcasts after Midway insisted the Imperial Navy had won, despite losing 4 carriers. Soldiers knew the truth long before the papers admitted it, and the lies only deepened their cynicism. The psychological toll was corrosive. Soldiers who might have tolerated hardship began to distrust everything. Orders sounded like propaganda. Reports from commanders sounded like speeches. Even letters from home sometimes seemed suspect, filtered through censors who blacked out inconvenient truths. In a world saturated with lies, paranoia thrived. Was the enemy really retreating, or was that another invented slogan? Was the war truly winnable, or was the poster on the barracks wall just another cruel joke? And yet, propaganda was not entirely ineffective. Sometimes it worked too well. Soldiers clung to slogans like lifelines, repeating them as mantras. A scrap of paper with "victory is certain" could mean the difference between despair and another day of marching. The human brain, desperate for order, sometimes accepted lies as a kindness. And as you sit now, staring at the bright colours of a poster promising victory, you realise something. The war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, it is fought with words, printed and shouted, words that seep into the mind until you cannot tell where truth ends and slogans begin. But if propaganda twisted reality with lies, the constant separation from home shattered it completely. Because nothing tested sanity more than being thousands of miles away, watching your world unravel while pretending you would one day return to a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. If you ever wondered what finally broke most soldiers in the Second World War, it was not just bullets or bombs. It was the crushing exhaustion that came from days, sometimes weeks, without proper sleep. Insomnia was as much an enemy as the Wehrmacht or the Imperial Japanese Army. And the absurdity of it all is that commanders often treated sleep like a luxury, not a necessity, turning millions of men into shambling, twitching wrecks. On the front lines, soldiers slept in fragments. 15 minutes in a trench, 20 minutes in the back of a truck, half an hour in a ruined farmhouse with shells rattling the windows. The human body can survive only so long on this kind of broken rhythm. In Italy in 1944, entire platoons reported hallucinations after 3 days of almost no rest. Men swore they saw phantom columns of tanks rolling through valleys, or mistook tree stumps for enemy soldiers. Some even claimed to hold conversations with family members who were not there. The US Army Medical Branch conducted studies during the war that showed soldiers awake for 72 hours had the reaction times of drunk drivers. Yet those same men were still expected to load artillery, navigate tanks, and storm machine gun nests. You can imagine the quality of decision-making. Commanders themselves noted that by the third night of combat, units began to disintegrate not from enemy fire, but from sheer neurological collapse. Even when men did sleep, they often did it in grotesque conditions. In the Pacific, foxholes flooded with rain so badly that soldiers would doze half submerged, their heads resting against the slick sides of mud walls. In Northern Europe, frostbite and frozen ground meant sleep often came in short, painful bursts, with boots still laced on to prevent feet from swelling and freezing. And if you thought that was bad, the constant terror of gas attacks meant that in some campaigns, soldiers were instructed to sleep with masks either on or nearby, ready to strap in at a moment's notice. Try drifting off while clutching a rubber facepiece against your chest. It was not just the front lines. Bomber crews in the air war lived on exhaustion. A single long mission could last 10 or 12 hours, and then they were expected to fly again after only a day of recovery. One British study found that after 3 missions in a week, airmen were essentially walking corpses. By the 6th mission, many exhibited symptoms of what we would now recognise as acute sleep deprivation psychosis. Some men reported forgetting their own names mid-flight. Others froze at the controls, their brains simply shutting down. To counteract the problem, armies turned to chemical solutions. The German military distributed Pervitin, a methamphetamine tablet nicknamed pilot's chocolate, or tank chocolate. Soldiers who took it could march for 2 days without sleep, eyes wide and jaws clenched. British and American forces were not much better, issuing millions of benzodrine tablets to keep men awake during operations like D-Day. The problem was that while these drugs could make you feel invincible, they also shredded your nervous system. Soldiers reported paranoia, violent mood swings, and crashes so severe they could not lift a rifle afterward. The result was armies of half-mad insomniacs shuffling across Europe and Asia. In diaries and letters, men confessed to sleeping while marching, collapsing into ditches mid-stride, or waking up with rifles still in hand and no memory of having fallen down. Medical officers noted that chronic sleep loss left soldiers more vulnerable to disease, more likely to crack under pressure, and more inclined to reckless behaviour. The truth was that exhaustion killed quietly, with fewer headlines than gunfire but just as much efficiency. Of course, soldiers did develop coping mechanisms. Some swore by catnaps, snatching 2 minutes with helmets pulled over their faces before the next shelling. Others relied on rituals like reciting prayers, chewing gum, or drinking coffee so black it looked like tar scrape from a truck engine. The joke was that if caffeine were measured by blood type, most soldiers would have tested espresso positive. But humour aside, the damage was profound. Sleep deprivation left men more prone to trauma. Historians studying combat fatigue, what we would now call PTSD, note that exhaustion magnified the psychological toll of warfare. A rested mind might withstand stress, but an exhausted one cracked like glass. Shell shock in World War I had already shown this link, and World War II proved it again. Entire companies collapsed when sleep disappeared. And the strangest irony of all, soldiers sometimes got their best rest when they were finally wounded. Men taken off the line with injuries often described their relief not just in escaping combat, but in finally being allowed to sleep undisturbed in a hospital cot. Imagine a world so twisted that getting shot was your ticket to 8 hours under a blanket. Sleep, or the lack of it, shaped the war in ways that strategy books rarely mention. Battles were won not just by numbers and weapons, but by whichever side could keep men awake long enough to stumble forward. And in this sense, every exhausted soldier was a reminder that war did not just chew through bodies, it chewed through time, rhythm, and sanity itself. and if sleep deprivation was not enough to hollow out the mind of a soldier, the food on his plate often finished the job. Because what men ate in the war was as strange, unsettling and spirit-breaking as the insomnia that haunted them. You might think a soldier's greatest enemy was enemy fire, but spend enough time in the Second World War and you'll realise the true villain often came in a small olive-drab tin. Because what soldiers ate was less about nourishment and more about a test of psychological endurance. Take the American K ration. Invented by Ansel Keys, the same man who gave us the word calorie, this compact meal was designed for paratroopers and light infantry. On paper, it had everything: canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered coffee, a vitamin tablet, and usually a chocolate bar or some chewing gum. In reality, it tasted like cardboard dipped in desperation. Soldiers joked that K stood for killed appetite. By the third day of living on them, men would rather trade with locals for mouldy bread than choke down another slab of compressed meat product that was supposedly chicken. British troops fared no better. Their infamous compo rations often came with tins of steak and kidney pudding, or corned beef hash. But months of storage in jungle humidity or desert heat turned them into grey sludge that sloshed out like industrial cement. Soldiers learned to identify good tins not by reading the labels, but by shaking them and listening. If it gurgled, it was probably edible. If it clunked, congratulations. You had just been issued a solid block of spoiled fat. And then there was the German side. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on Eisener Portion, the iron ration. These emergency packs contained hard biscuits, canned meat, and sometimes coffee substitute made from roasted barley. Coffee substitute sounds harmless until you realise it tasted like someone had strained hot water through a charred sock. Even Hitler's supposedly efficient army could not disguise the fact that soldiers were basically gnawing on stale bread and drinking sadness. The Japanese Imperial Army may have had the most brutal system of all. Rice was the core, but often in short supply. Men stretched it with millet, beans, or whatever could be scrounged. Protein often came in the form of dried fish, or preserved plums so sour they could make your jaw lock. Malnutrition was rampant. Diseases like beriberi, caused by lack of vitamin B1, spread through ranks like wildfire. Imagine trying to fight in the jungle while your legs gave out from nerve damage because your commanders forgot vitamins existed. But the worst of all rations were not even the official ones. They were the improvised meals. Soldiers in North Africa often resorted to frying up locusts when supply lines collapsed. In the Pacific, some men hunted rats in camps just to get protein. One British officer in Burma wrote that he had eaten curry made of indistinct meat, which is military code for "do not ask questions or you will lose your appetite." If the taste and scarcity were not enough, the packaging could also kill you. American sea rations came in sharp-edged cans that sometimes cut open fingers. In field hospitals, doctors reported infections caused by tin wounds, and the can openers. Soldiers often lost them, forcing them to smash cans open with bayonets or rifle butts, which usually meant spilling half the contents into the mud. Nothing says dinner like eating beans with dirt sprinkles, and yet soldiers got creative. Some brewed ersatz coffee by filtering rainwater through their socks, then sweetened it with crushed army-issued candy. Others mixed powdered lemonade with liquor from local villages to create something resembling a cocktail. In Italy, GIs famously combined chocolate rations with captured eggs to make field brownies. It sounds almost charming until you realise the eggs were usually half spoiled and the chocolate was waxy to survive transport. The psychological toll of food cannot be overstated. Soldiers wrote in letters that they dreamed about fresh bread more than women. In prisoner of war camps, men would sit around and describe in excruciating detail the meals they wanted when the war ended. This menu dreaming became so common it was practically therapy. In fact, researchers later linked those obsessive food conversations to the same kind of fixation seen in starvation studies. The body was screaming for real nourishment, and the brain obliged by imagining roasts, pies, and fresh milk. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that even when rations worked as intended, soldiers still burned them off in hours. A frontline infantryman might need 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. The rations barely covered that, especially after supply lines broke. By the end of a long campaigns, men's uniforms hung loose, belts cinched to the last hole. Some soldiers lost so much weight that helmets slid down over their eyes mid-battle. So when you picture the war, do not just think of bullets and bombs. Think of endless cans of grey meat paste, stale biscuits, and men fantasizing about butter like it was the Holy Grail. Hunger was as much a weapon as any rifle, grinding soldiers down until the thought of home-cooked stew was enough to bring tears to their eyes. And yet, if eating was misery, drinking was often madness. Because once the bottles came out, the lines between camaraderie, coping and catastrophe blurred into one long drunken march through the war. And that, brave dreamer, is your guided tour through the wonderfully miserable lives of World War II soldiers, a world where your best friend was a can of grey meat paste, your worst enemy was your eyelids, and your most trusted officer was a teddy bear missing half its stuffing. If you made it this far without dozing off, congratulations. You now have the stamina of a man fueled entirely by stale biscuits and army-issue instant coffee. If this story kept you company tonight, go ahead and give it a like. It helps way more than a tin of powdered eggs ever did. And if you really enjoyed drifting off to the sound of history's darkest absurdities, check out my other videos after this one. They are packed with even more strange, revolting and hilarious pieces of the past, guaranteed to make your mattress feel like paradise compared to the trenches. So lay back, close your eyes, and be grateful that your bedtime snack is not a can of something called meat product number 3. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next nightmare disguised as history lesson.